Hello, and thank you very much for coming along today. Today we're going to look at Africa and world historical cartography, particularly at old maps, new techniques, new questions, and new research communities that are evolving around the question of Africa and world historical cartography. As you can see from some of the earliest maps, Africa figures prominently in the first efforts to present a global map of the world. John Hessler, curator at the Library of Congress, presented one of the most celebrated maps at an exhibit in Washington, D.C., when the map by Martin Waldseemüller was presented to the public in an exhibit in 2016. Let's have a look at the coverage of the Library of Congress exhibit from a report at the time by the Voice of America.
This is the Waldseemüller map, displayed in the pre-colonial pavilion of the Library of Congress. It's protected behind a double glass casing filled with argon gas, away from harmful lighting and flash photography. For those who want a closer look, the library provides a facsimile of the map.
This is the 1507 map by Martin Waldseemüller, one of the most important maps ever created in the history of cartography. It's been called the birth certificate of America because it is the first map to name the continent.
Historians are unclear why the German cartographer chose to name the new lands in honor of the explorer Amerigo Vespucci instead of Christopher Columbus, who in fact discovered America. Curator John Hessler offers his own explanation.
The way I'd like to say it is Columbus discovered America, Vespucci sold it. Vespucci did market himself more.
Unlike Columbus, who thought he had discovered a new route to India, Vespucci realized it was a new continent and was very active in promoting his travels. Waldseemüller produced the map only 15 years after Columbus landed on the shores of the new continent, when few European settlements existed and the mass of land remained mostly unknown. Yet the map provides an outline of the New World and bears a surprising resemblance to the eastern coast of the American continent. Waldseemüller's own words suggest that this map was more than a lucky vision. The cartographer reassures his contemporaries of the accuracy of his work.
And this little piece of text is a really amazing little piece of text. And what it really says in Latin is that if you're not familiar with the new discoveries, if you're not familiar with the discoveries of Columbus, Vespucci, and you look at this map for the first time, you might be concerned. There's a lot of things in here that you haven't recognized before. But you shouldn't be, because this is the way you will come to see your world in the future.
The map was discovered in 1901 in a German castle, but it took over 100 years and generous support from private donors to raise the funds for its purchase. In 2007, in the presence of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, the Library of Congress introduced the public to the Waldseemüller map. A treasure forgotten for centuries on the dusty shelves of a German castle now attracts millions. Ardita Dunellari, VOA News, Washington.
So, we're still confronted with the problem of Africa and world historical cartography. As John Hessler has pointed out in great detail, the Waldseemüller map is famous not for its depiction of Africa, even though it's quite prominent, but for its naming of the New World. How do we restore, in some sense, the balance, some refocus on the major portions of the map? Africa itself, for example. What should we do to undertake the study of Africa and world historical cartography? Well, as it turns out, John Hessler is quite a genius and has looked into these problems a great deal. And he's underscored that all historical maps present complex questions that deserve extended scientific research and in-depth humanist scholarship in history, culture, and the biography of the map makers themselves. Let's take a look.
Historians of science generally divide unsolved problems into really two different camps. One, factual. Those are things like, is the JCB map printed before 1513? Do the 1507 globe gores come before the 1507 map? All of these sort of factual controversies that surround Waldseemüller scholarship. And the other part of it is historians of science tend to talk about conceptual issues. And those of you who know any of my work know that I'm really not so interested in the factual stuff. I'm much more interested in the conceptual grounding of the things. What I want to know is, how did Waldseemüller think? What was it like to be a humanist cartographer sitting in Santiago trying to come to terms with all of this new information that was coming at them? Now, so I'm going to deal with just a few conceptual issues today. One, and from my perspective, the most important issue conceptually and historically in any scholarship on early maps is the problem of transmission. It's an issue that is rarely dealt with in scholarship in any detailed way. Most of the cartographic scholarship deals with what I will call coastline matching. This map must have come from this map, must have come from this map. Also a lot of linguistic work. And that's interesting, but it doesn't really give us any sense of the networks of transmission. How is this information flowing? What networks are being established that allow this information to flow? The second problem, which is really related to that, is once you have a group of sources gathered together, how is geographic knowledge produced? How is it that a cartographer faced with 30 or 40 different maps which tell a slightly different story blends them together to form something like Waldseemüller's map? How does that actually occur? And the third and really related question is a question of epistemology of the mixed sciences. At the time of Waldseemüller, the sciences were really divided under firm Aristotelian categorical lines. You had things like mathematics and astronomy, which simply dealt with the perfection of the world, things that were unchanging. And then you had things like physics, which dealt with substance. But the mixed sciences, like cartography, are a totally different thing. And there have been very, very few scholars who have actually come to terms with the question of what is the epistemology of the mixed sciences during this period. What did a humanist cartographer, a scientifically trained, a scientifically curious humanist cartographer of the late 15th and 16th century know? What is it that they were bringing to bear on these creations to produce what is the final act of a long research program rather than its initial beginnings?
So, John Hessler has underscored that all historical maps present complex questions that deserve both extended factual research and what he prefers, the in-depth humanist scholarship in history, culture, and cosmology. That's what he's been a leader in directing our attention to, both nationally and internationally, as it can be seen from these Waldseemüller discussions that took place in Washington, D.C. over several years, in which he played a prominent, in fact dominant, role. With these valuable insights in mind, how might we most fruitfully undertake African historical cartography? The problem is evident. How might we approach it? Well, as it turns out, in addition to John Hessler's work and his very substantial contributions to world map historiography, another distinguished humanist scholar from the Library of Congress has provided the inspiration for how we might proceed with this new global initiative concerning Africa. His name is Prosser Gifford. He's well known to African historians for the reasons that are largely established before he went to the Library of Congress. In fact, he had a whole series of careers before coming to the Library of Congress. It's worth remembering that he was, for example, the first professor to teach courses in African history in the Department of History at Yale University. In remembering his presence there, there's a long and strong tradition of realizing that he established not only African history but African studies at Yale University during his brief time there. In addition, he cooperated with, in fact, collaborated very closely with the Yale president Kingman Brewster Jr. to create an entirely new program, giving undergraduates an extra year, the fifth year, in the midst of the Vietnam War, to go and work in Africa and other parts of the Third World on self-sustaining jobs in order to get to know large portions of Africa, Latin America, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. He established a program and became its director. So, before he came to the Library of Congress, where he also had a distinguished career, he had a substantial credentials as an African historian. At the Library of Congress, he helped establish, among other things, as director of scholarly programs, a whole series of initiatives. And along with the librarian, they created a whole center for the humanist studies, the Kluge Center, which he became the first director of and the creator of the first endowed chair to give a presentation at the Library of Congress. A very distinguished career. Before coming to the Library of Congress, he was, in fact, a Rhodes Scholar. And it's the work he did both in Oxford and at Yale, and then subsequently in teaching African history at Amherst College, before coming down to the Smithsonian Institution, where he was the deputy director of the Woodrow Wilson Center for a while, and then came over to the Library of Congress. It is in all those earlier capacities that he developed a new approach to the study of Africa through historical cartography. Throughout all his work as an African historian, he taught that our understanding of African history, in fact all history, is shaped by two principal factors. First, the nature of the data we have available to interpret and discuss. And second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle to discuss it. As he called it, the circle. In fact, it's from that notion of a circle of those who discuss the maps that a whole new organization got going. It's called the Africa Map Circle, and it focuses now on digital resources for the study of African historical maps.
What's happening is that detailed maps of the slave trade are now becoming a matter of immense interest because they indicate the kinds of things that must have been going on in Africa prior to the departure of slave ships for the New World. These can be laid on top of one another and on top of the Google Earth base and analyzed in reference to those geologic realities underneath them. The result is you can look at new features of Africa, or I should say, age-old features of Africa in a new way, like river basins and deserts, mountains and forests, all of which are rapidly changing in our climate circumstance. If you map some of the historical material on top of these geologic views from space, satellite views, you can learn a great deal. especially if you look at them in detail. That's now become possible. It's become possible because of the digitization revolution. These maps can be digitized and shaped in different ways to fit on geologic substrates, but also they can be blown up and expanded to read details barely legible in smaller sizes, and certainly not available to the general public because these are rare and fragile maps, which few people used to get access to. Now, however, with digitization undertaken in part to conserve these maps, these digitized images can be shared and examined by groups of people never previously having access to them. Take a look, for example, at what is being undertaken in the Africa Map Circle, a group of people internationally that have gotten together to share this kind of information and share their analyses of these maps. They're inspired in part by the work of Prosser Gifford, a professor of African history for a long time. He died recently in 2020, but he taught that our understanding of African history, in fact, all history, is shaped by two principal factors. First, the nature of the data we have available to interpret and discuss, and second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle to discuss it, discuss the maps, discuss the documents, and the like. That's crucial. First, the nature of the data. Second, the range of people and perspectives who are included in the circle, as he called it, in the circle to discuss it. That's a key concept. Who's in the circle? Well, the Africa Map Circle is trying to expand the circle beyond those who had access to rare book libraries or map collections of a specialized type to a much broader range of historians, scholars, students, and the general public. The Africa Map Circle seeks to be inclusive, whereas previous collections were by intention exclusive in the sense that you needed to preserve these maps, and that meant that they were kept from the public largely and only displayed in certain occasions and under very controlled conditions. But what is the circle? Well, let's take a look at it. The Africa Map Circle is a very interesting new intellectual enterprise because you could argue that the African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline. It was circumnavigated long before the Americas, or for Australia, for example, or certainly for Asia and large parts of the Russian north, the Siberian plains. But Africa maps were made largely and created by non-Africans. Now, this is an interesting anomaly. The first continent, you could call it that, to be fully encircled and mapped, but mapped by those who weren't from the continent by and large. Therefore, African maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the beginning. What are the early maps? Well, in many cases, they're transcriptions of places and names for places that were used in the local language. In other cases, they're names applied from European traditions. But which European tradition? Well, it depends upon the European group making the map. So there's a hodgepodge of different names, sometimes referring to places, sometimes referring to kingdoms, sometimes referring to names of peoples or associations of peoples or federations of tribes. other times referring to rather mundane things like salt pans and hard rock. These maps are multicultural to begin with, and they require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. They can't be understood from only one linguistic tradition, for example, nor can they be fully understood if we don't understand what a place name means in the local language. Digital technology now makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. This is what's new. The maps are old, but the technology is allowing us to do new things with them. The result is that the collaborative study of African maps can now provide a new paradigm for international and multicultural teaching and learning. This is very important because the techniques devised here are not just exclusive to Africa. They can be applied to any part of the globe with any linguistic tradition. The study of Chinese maps, for example, could be undertaken in the same way that we're studying now maps in the Africa Map Circle. Study of Arabic maps of Africa, could be included in the same kind of scope, and with great results. Let's see what its intentions are. You might well ask, well, what is it? And you could scan the QR code and find out for yourself. How can it help me? How can it help those I know learn more or teach about Africa? Well, check it out. Scan the code and begin to participate, learn more, and join in. The goals of the Africa Map Circle are pretty simple and can be outlined very quickly. First, to provide readily available public access for scholars and students to historical and contemporary maps of Africa. Second, to provide for educators and students at all levels of teaching and learning resources to use in their own research and their development of online curricula, with selected examples provided from the Africa Map Circle's own Explorations series. And 3, to inspire and encourage scholars and students to expand and extend and share these tools in developing their own online African history research and teaching in Africa, the Americas, in Europe, Asia, and in fact, throughout the world. This is the kind of thing that could facilitate the Chinese study of Africa, the study of Arab countries along the northern part of Africa, and their understanding in their own cartographic tradition of sub-Saharan Africa, their understanding of the Indian Ocean and the role that African traders played in the Indian Ocean. All of these new extensible research areas can be absorbed in what the Africa Map Circle is beginning to undertake. In the future, the Africa Map Circle will seek to provide a platform upon which to share scholarly research and novel instruction initiatives that demonstrate a creative use of maps in online teaching and learning about Africa throughout the world. So, join up, join in. The Africa Map Circle is something for the public in general to learn from and learn about. Under lockdown, which we've all experienced for the last year and a half or so, this has become particularly important because learning under lockdown has changed from the very basic levels of elementary school right up through colleges, universities, and graduate school. Everyone's had to shelter in place and hunker down in a kind of new isolationism. Africa is a huge place, but we didn't learn much about it by going there during the last 18 months. Couldn't go there. Similarly, Africans couldn't come out from the continent and tell us, as they normally have, as exchange students throughout the Western world. That lockdown has meant there's been a kind of cutoff of the usual educational process. But we've devised new tools and developed some tips for online learning about Africa and the world during this lockdown.
So, briefly, you can get a sense of how it operates and what its goals are. This was established after Prosper Gifford died at the age of 91, but his inspiration as an African historian and as a major contributor to the humanities and humanities scholarship at the Library of Congress is what inspired the work to create the Africa Map Circle. Some of the technologies involved can be summarized very quickly. Individual institutions, in fact, are in the process of institutional digital conservation. They're trying to preserve their maps and keep them available for study while not destroying them. Other technologies include Google Earth, and in fact, every single major university or college, both in this country and around the world, is starting to digitize their own collections, not only within libraries, but within museums. And consortia are beginning to emerge between universities and the universities and their own museums in order to share digitized information. This is providing a powerful new platform to bring new communities of scholars together. When this is combined with public access television, which every community that has cable access in the United States has access to, because the cable companies have to provide a TV station for citizen access, this can become very powerful. Cambridge Community Television up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Harvard is located, has made good use of this over the years. And they've combined it with the distribution of some of their programs over YouTube, perhaps the largest single electronic communication of video material in the world. These programs can be conveyed very quickly and very powerfully through QR codes so that high school students, college students, graduate students, researchers of all kinds can instantly get access to troves of information and interpretation through the lectures and the discussions that emerge among new communities of scholars. So what's possible is pretty extraordinary and seems to have no limit. What is actually going to happen has to do with the institutions that embrace these technologies and learn how to integrate them in order to make their rare and in some cases disappearing collections available for wider and wider communities. As Prosper Gifford called it, the circle of those who get to discuss the material. To begin then, the maps and individual institutions hold are in the process of being digitized. And they've been the focus of exchange on YouTube for reasons related most recently to COVID. It's been impossible to get scholars together for large international meetings, but through Zoom technology, it is possible to share these meetings internationally with digitized material such that people can share scholarship with original documents on a level never previously conceived. You can find out about this on YouTube by simply typing in the question, what is the Africa Map Circle? And you'll get connected to it. Here you can learn about the African historical cartography that's underway and find out what's happening in this research. Basically, old maps are being combined with new digital technology to create new communities, each with their own narrative in African and global history. This is something quite new, especially when it can be shared across continents and in university contexts for new kinds of research. Africa and world historical cartography? Well, what are the possible next steps? As John Hessler points out, even the Walser-Miller map, which is the most adventurous early representations of global mapping capacity and imagination, is itself famous not so much for its depiction of Africa at the center of the map, but for the fact that it calls the continent over to the left America, after Amerigo Vespucci, the Italian explorer who discovered the fact that it was a continent, not, as Columbus thought, merely a representation or a foreground to the Japanese and Asian world. Although the word Indian has been borrowed to describe Native Americans because of the mistake of thinking that he had run into Asia, India, and the Far East, America has stuck with the label for the whole of the Western Hemisphere. And those in North America like to appropriate it, thinking it only refers to the current day United States. In fact, the Americas, it refer to the whole Western Hemisphere. Well, what possible next steps could we take then in looking at Africa and world historical cartography? Well, we may not have too long to wait, as it turns out. In fact, the new communities of discussion may be already engaged. Consider, for example, the World Maps exhibit that's going to be taking place, in fact, is already taking place at Beinecke Library and the Yale campus. It opened up on the 22nd of July and is going to be running through January. Now, Yale is known to have porcelain sea charts in its collections, and linking them in historical terms of the kind of discussion that John Hessler has urged would have to link Mediterranean history with West African history. A close study of these porcelains can be very instructive as you go down the coast and do, as John Hessler suggested, the first level of research to compare coastlines. Comparing the coastlines of areas of North Africa with West Africa over the history of the porcelain maps is an extraordinary step forward. It hasn't yet been done in detail, but perhaps the Yale Beinecke librarians are up to the task. This is the exhibit. As I say, it's underway from Friday, 22 July 2022 to Sunday, January 8th, 2023. Get over there. Look at the maps. Among other things, you'll realize that the inscriptions on them are in Arabic. World maps take on a whole new meaning in the manuscript and maps collection of the Beinecke Library. And the Beinecke Library curators are well aware of the Atlantic tradition. The porcelains, in fact, contain descriptions of Africa and of the New World, in this case Brazil, and they've been the subject of recent scholarship by Alida Metcalf, a specialist in Brazilian history, not African history, but she's focused her historical eye on the question of mapping the Atlantic world. Now this includes Africa and the New World, and moves beyond the Mediterranean. The Beinecke map curators are well aware of this important new scholarship, and perhaps they'll bring it into context in their discussions planned as part of the Africa map presentation. Much of the mapping of the Atlantic system has to do directly with the different European traditions of mapping the slave trade from its earliest days. And this may be a theme that could be pursued on several different fronts, both those looking at mapping and charting of ocean materials and coastal regions, as well as continental regions, especially as different European traditions come into the mix. Those of us in Western universities often know of the scholarship undertaken in French and English sources, but we forget that the first several hundred years of the Atlantic system emerged well before the French or the British got involved. The Portuguese, and then the Dutch, and the Spanish were all involved in the Atlantic system trade, and in fact established some of the best and earliest mapping traditions of the coast. All of this can now be taken into account and studied in detail by groups like the Africa Map Circle. So it appears that there's much that remains to be learned in the Gifford tradition. First historian of Africa at Yale, enormous contributor to the intellectual life at the Library of Congress years later, and is perhaps in bringing together those two traditions, African history and historical cartography, that the Gifford tradition can most fruitfully be carried forward. Thank you very much.